Today, on March 9th, the world woke up to something the oil market hasn't seen since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Brent crude broke $100 a barrel, and it's still climbing. But the oil price is not the real story here. The oil price is the symptom. The actual story happened yesterday, on March 8th, inside a country still under bombardment. Iran named a new supreme leader. His name is Mojtaba Khamenei. He is 56 years old. He is the son of the man the United States and Israel killed on February 28th. And according to analysts across the board, he is harder than his father ever was. That single fact is why Brent moved $40 in 10 days. Not supply data, not OPEC. Him. Alan Ayer, a former U.S. diplomat and Iran specialist, described Mojtaba as worse and more hardline than his father. He added that Mojtaba has a lot of revenge to exact. That one sentence explains the oil price move better than any supply-demand model. Markets are not just pricing in barrels. They are pricing in the psychology of this specific man. A man whose wife, Zara Haddad Adel, and one of his sons were killed in the strike on February 28th. His mother, the wife of Ali Khamenei, died of her wounds days later. So today we are going to break this down layer by layer. Who is Mojtaba Khamenei, how he got here, and what his ideology means for the Strait of Hormuz and for your gas bill. Because mainstream coverage is focused entirely on the price number. The story behind that number is where the real picture lives, and that is exactly what we are here to unpack. Let's start with February 28th, because the context of that day is everything. The US and Israel launched coordinated strikes targeting military sites and the compound of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Khamenei was killed in the strike. His daughter-in-law Zara Haddad Adel, their son, and his son-in-law all died. His wife survived the strike, but died of her wounds days later. Mojtaba, the second son, was not in the compound that day. He survived. And within 10 days, the country his father ruled for 36 years put him in charge of it. Now here's the part that explains why analysts say the oil market reaction is not a short-term spike. The succession process itself tells you everything about where Iran is headed. The Assembly of Experts, the 88-member clerical body that formally selects Iran's supreme leader, met under extraordinary wartime conditions. Several members attended online. Participants described the session as unnatural. Those who opposed Mojtaba were given limited time to speak. The process moved faster than any prior leadership transition in the Republic's history. According to Iran International, IRGC commanders applied direct pressure on assembly members through repeated phone calls and in-person visits before the vote was held. The vote was pushed through. U.S. and Israeli bombs struck the assembly's offices in Qom after the votes were cast, but before the count was officially complete. 8 members threatened to boycott a second session. A conservative commentator publicly called the appointment potentially divisive and said it should be delayed until after the war. The internal opposition inside Iran's own clerical establishment was real and documented. But none of it changed the outcome, because the IRGC wanted Mojtaba Khamenei. And in the current power structure of the Islamic Republic, what the IRGC wants, it gets. In my view, this is the single most important institutional signal of the entire conflict so far. Iran's most significant leadership transition in 37 years happened not through theology, but through military pressure. The IRGC didn't just back the new supreme leader. It effectively installed him. That distinction matters enormously for everything that comes next. The war, Hormuz, and the diplomatic landscape. So who is the man the Revolutionary Guard chose? Mojtaba Khamenei has been at the center of Iranian power for decades, just almost entirely out of public view. He joined the IRGC in 1987 and served in the Iran-Iraq War. He studied theology in Qom. He never held elected office, never gave Friday sermons, never delivered major public addresses. Most ordinary Iranians have never heard his voice. But inside the office of the supreme leader, known in Persian as the Beit, he was for years the man who actually controlled access to his father. Analysts at the Atlantic Council, including Iran specialists Kasra Arabi and Saeed Golkar, described him as effectively a mini supreme leader operating in his father's shadow for over a decade. He coordinated military, intelligence, and political decisions behind closed doors. U.S. diplomatic cables from the late 2000s published by WikiLeaks described him as the power behind the robes. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned him in 2019 for advancing his father's destabilizing regional agenda. That is not diplomatic language. That is a formal legal determination based on intelligence. CNN described his appointment as turning the Islamic Republic into a dynasty, something many Iranians had hoped the assembly would never allow. The move was framed as a deliberate act of defiance. The Washington Post was equally direct. Mojtaba's selection sent a message of defiance against Donald Trump. The assembly chose the very man Trump had publicly called unacceptable. One assembly member stated the candidate was picked because he would be hated by the enemy. Not credentials, not experience. Being hated by America was the stated qualification. That tells you everything. Now, let's connect this directly to what oil is doing today, because the two stories are completely inseparable. Brent crude began 2026 near $70 a barrel. JP Morgan's full-year forecast was $60. Then, February 28th happened. Oil jumped past $80 by midweek. It closed near $93 on Friday. By Sunday, it crossed $100 for the first time since the Ukraine invasion. Monday morning, it briefly touched just under $120. According to Rapidan Energy Group, the Iran war has disrupted 20% of global oil supply for 9 days straight. They called it more than double the previous record, the Suez Crisis of 1956 and 1957. Iraq and Kuwait have already cut production by 70% and declared force majeure, according to Fortune. Storage tanks are full. Crude has nowhere to go because export routes are blocked or avoided. Bahrain's state oil company declared force majeure too. Iran struck Bahrain's refinery complex and set it ablaze. Israel hit 5 oil facilities near Tehran on Saturday. Infrastructure on both sides is burning. Average U.S. gasoline prices jumped from under $3 per gallon before the strikes to $3.45 as of Sunday per WLA. Patrick DeHaan at GasBuddy projected a $4 national average within days. That is not an abstraction. That is 50 cents more per gallon in 10 days. And the Kepler analyst, Homayoun Falak-Shahi, told CNN that oil could reach $150 by end of March if tanker traffic doesn't resume. What this suggests is that Mojtaba's appointment is not just a geopolitical story. It is a direct economic variable. A harder, less negotiable supreme leader means a lower probability of swift resolution. Lower probability of resolution means Hormuz stays under pressure longer. Longer pressure means higher prices for longer. The market is not being irrational. It is doing exactly what it is designed to do. In my view, the most consequential detail in this entire story is not the price. It is the timing. Mojtaba was appointed while bombs were still falling on Iranian cities, while his family was still being buried. That combination, personal loss, IRGC backing, ideological hardline record, and appointment under fire, creates a leadership profile the global oil market has genuinely never had to price before. And it is telling you exactly that with a move of nearly $40 per barrel in 10 days. When markets move that fast, they are not overreacting. They are recognizing that something structural has changed. If this is the kind of full picture analysis you come to this channel for, drop a comment right now with where you think Brent crude goes by the end of March, and hit the like button. It helps this reach more people. Because next, we are going inside the Strait of Hormuz, what is actually happening to tanker traffic right now, and what Iran's naval posture looks like under the new leadership. We will also cover why the most dangerous move Iran can make right now does not require firing a single missile. Stay with me. The next layer is where the real economic stakes live. Iran didn't close the Strait of Hormuz with a naval blockade. It didn't need to. All it took was a few drone strikes near the waterway, and insurance companies did the rest. That is the line from Helima Croft at RBC Capital Markets that explains the Hormuz situation better than anything else published this week. It's really an insurance-driven shutdown, she told NPR. Insurers wouldn't underwrite ships. Companies wouldn't risk passage without coverage. The world's most important energy waterway closed itself from the inside. No mines required, no fleet battle. Let's look at what actually happened, because the sequence of events matters. On the night of February 28th, outgoing tanker traffic through the strait was still heavy. Ships were leaving, nobody was going back in. By March 1st, tanker traffic through the strait had dropped to near zero. Wikipedia's real-time conflict tracking confirmed not a single commercial vessel was observed transiting on March 1st and 2nd. On March the 2nd, an IRGC commander declared the strait closed on international maritime radio, the emergency frequency every captain monitors at all times. Any vessel attempting to pass, he said, would be set ablaze. By March 4th, NBC News and Marine Traffic confirmed traffic was down approximately 90% versus the prior week. By March 7th, Windward Maritime AI recorded just 3 total crossings for the entire day. 3. In a waterway that normally processes dozens of transits every single hour, 3 crossings in a full day is the clearest number available for what this crisis has done to global energy infrastructure. Right now, Lloyd's List Intelligence reports around 200 compliant tankers stranded inside the Persian Gulf. 60 of them are very large crude carriers, nearly 8% of the entire global VLCC fleet. They are anchored, they are slow steaming, they are sitting at terminals with full hulls and nowhere to go. The crude is loaded. The buyers are waiting. The exit is closed. Natasha Canova, head of global commodities research at JP Morgan, described it in a Sunday note as the clock ticking. The longer tankers stay penned in, the more Gulf storage fills, and the more production shuts down. Iraq has already cut output by 1.5 million barrels per day, Reuters confirmed, because storage is full. Iraq relies almost entirely on the strait for exports. There is no other meaningful outlet for Basra crude. Now here is the insurance mechanism in detail, because this is the real story that most coverage is burying as a footnote. The International Group of P&I Clubs insures roughly 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage. They depend on reinsurance markets for catastrophic risk. When that reinsurance capacity contracts, the entire chain breaks. War risk premiums before the strikes were around 0.125% to 0.25% per transit. Windward Maritime AI confirmed rates surged sharply by early March, and in many cases coverage became unavailable entirely. For a very large crude tanker, that premium increase adds hundreds of thousands of dollars per transit. But the deeper issue is not cost, it is availability. You cannot buy insurance that isn't being offered. Trump recognized this early. On March 3rd, he pledged U.S. Navy escorts for tankers and announced the Development Finance Corporation would provide political risk insurance for shipping in the Gulf. As of March 9th, traffic remains near standstill. The White House told reporters the administration has no timeline for when the strait will be safe for commercial shipping again. One K-Peeler analyst told CNBC that insurance isn't even the primary obstacle anymore. Ship owners need a sustained period without attacks before anyone ventures back in, and attacks have continued. On March 7th, the Maltese-flagged tanker Prima was struck by an Iranian drone while attempting to transit. The IRGC claimed responsibility and stated the vessel had ignored repeated warnings to turn back. The electronic warfare layer makes the physical environment even more hostile. Windward Maritime AI reported GPS jamming affecting over 1,650 ships in the Gulf on March 7th, up 55% from the week before. Ships were shown false positions across Kuwait, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE on their own navigation screens. 44 signal injection zones and 92 denial areas were active on March 4th alone. In a 33-kilometer-wide channel, navigating on spoofed GPS is not a risk any commercial operator without military escort will accept. The electronic warfare turns dangerous into operationally impossible. Now let's look at the LNG dimension, because this is hitting Europe and Asia in a completely different way from the crude oil story, and it is being badly underreported. Qatar is the world's largest LNG exporter. Its main facilities are at Ras Laffan and Mesaieed. Iran struck both. Qatar Energy confirmed it has ceased all LNG production following the attacks. Roughly 20% of global LNG supply passes through the strait, almost all of it from Qatar per time. European gas futures jumped around 30% after the Qatar strikes. LNG freight rates surged over 40% on Monday. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are watching their energy security collapse in real time. Almost entirely dependent on imported LNG, for these economies, this is not a gas bill story. It is an industrial crisis. The EIA confirmed 84% of all Hormuz crude in 2024 was destined for Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea together account for nearly 70% of all shipments through the strait. In my view, the most important phrase in this whole story came from Arne Lohmann Rasmussen at Global Risk Management speaking to CBS News. He called the strait de facto closed, in that no one dares to go through. De facto closed, not by naval order, not by mines in the water. Closed because the risk calculus of every commercial actor on Earth has shifted past the point where transit makes rational sense. That is a harder problem to solve than a traditional blockade. You can negotiate with a government. You can clear mines from a channel. You cannot negotiate with an insurance market that has walked away. Next, we're going to look at what this means for the American economy, for inflation, for the Federal Reserve's impossible position, and for the political math inside Washington right now. Stay with me. Trump told Reuters on Thursday he wasn't worried about rising gas prices. His exact words: "If they rise, they rise." That landed the same week gas hit the highest price of either of his presidential terms. That gap between what the president said and what Americans are paying at the pump is the political core of this story. It widens with every day the Strait of Hormuz stays shut. The national gas price average hit 3.41 per gallon on Saturday, according to ALEA. That is a jump of 43 cents in a single week. Gasoline prices are posted in giant numbers on every street corner. Drivers see them every few days. They are one of the most psychologically powerful economic signals in American life. And right now, they are moving in the wrong direction at the worst political moment. Before February 28th, Trump had genuine economic momentum. Inflation was at 2.4% in January, an 8-month low. Mortgage rates had just fallen below 6% for the first time since 2022. All of that is now under pressure from a single variable. And the math of how oil feeds into the broader economy is more connected than most people realize until they feel it personally. Higher jet fuel means higher airline tickets. Rising transport costs push grocery prices up. Petroleum-based products, plastics, packaging, fertilizer get more expensive, and that cost travels through everything. Goldman Sachs warned clients this week that sustained oil price gains pose a significant upside risk to inflation forecasts. Goldman had previously projected inflation ending 2026 at 2%, right at the Fed's target. That projection is now under serious pressure. Goldman was explicit. The risk to the inflation outlook rises with every week the disruption continues and shows no sign of resolving. Mark Zandi at Moody's Analytics told CNN, "There is no upside. There's just nothing but downside for the U.S. economy from this situation. No hedging, no caveats. That is the mainstream economic framing right now." Now, let's talk about the Federal Reserve. Because this is where the oil story and the political story collide most uncomfortably for the administration. The Fed was already expected to hold rates steady until at least summer before any of this began. Rates sit at 3.5% to 3.75%. Consumers have been paying elevated borrowing costs for 2 years. Mortgage rates had just dipped below 6% for the first time since 2022, a real relief signal for homebuyers. They moved back above 6% last week as Treasury yields rose on war uncertainty. New York Fed President John Williams said publicly this week that the Iran war would obviously affect the near-term inflation outlook. His follow-up: "Nobody can be sure of how long this will last. That uncertainty is the Fed's real problem, not the current oil price, the duration. If Hormuz stays shut for weeks rather than days, the inflation impact stops being a one-off shock and becomes a structural input." Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was direct. The Iran situation puts the Fed even more on hold, more reluctant to cut rates than before this started. That carries weight from someone who ran the institution. Now, here is where it becomes politically complex. Trump nominated Kevin Warsh to replace Jerome Powell as Fed chair when Powell's term ends in May. Warsh is historically hawkish, but has recently shifted toward cuts. An oil surge puts Warsh in an impossible spot before he even starts. Cut rates while inflation accelerates, and he looks politically captured. Hold rates, and he frustrates the president who appointed him. Multiple Wall Street economists describe the same dynamic this week. The Fed faces an impossible position, stuck between a war pushing inflation higher and a president demanding rates come down. That is the core tension for the next 6 months of American economic policy, and it gets harder to resolve the longer the Hormuz disruption continues. Let's look at the stock market, because the picture there adds another layer to why this matters, beyond the gas pump and the Fed meeting calendar. WTI crude logged its biggest weekly gain on record in data going back to 1983, per NBC News. Oil is up roughly 66% since the war began. The Dow Jones fell over 400 points on March 2nd alone. Historically, parabolic oil price moves have correlated with weaker consumer spending, higher inflation, and rising unemployment. The 1973 oil embargo and Kuwait's invasion in 1990 both preceded sharp equity downturns. The January producer price index rose 0.8% excluding food and energy, pushing the 12-month rate to 3.6%, well above the Fed's 2% target. And that reading was taken before a single strike hit Iran. In my view, the key phrase came from Gregory Dacko at EY on Friday. The conflict raises risks on both sides of the Fed's dual mandate, inflation rising while growth and employment soften at the same time. That combination has a name: stagflation. Cut rates to support growth and inflation gets worse. Raise rates to fight inflation and growth gets worse. There is no clean move available to policymakers. Nobody's predicting a 1970s-style stagflation outcome today, but professional economists are using that word in sourced mainstream publications. And that alone tells you where the risk horizon has moved in 10 days. What this suggests is that the chain from Tehran to Main Street runs directly through the Strait of Hormuz. Mortgage rates, car payments, grocery prices, all connected to whether that waterway reopens and when. And right now it is functionally closed under a leader one assembly member said was chosen because he would be hated by the enemy. That is not diplomacy. That is a doctrine. Stay with me. China imports roughly 40% of its oil and 30% of its LNG through the Strait of Hormuz. And right now, according to CSIS, Chinese tankers have all but stopped transiting the strait, just like everyone else. That single fact exposes one of the biggest geopolitical assumptions of the past decade. The idea that Beijing and Tehran's alignment would give Chinese vessels protected passage through any crisis. It has not happened. CSIS ship tracking data confirmed this week that Chinese tankers and container ships have ceased transits. Dozens of Chinese vessels are now trapped inside the Persian Gulf alongside everyone else's. Beijing is publicly pressing Iran to keep the strait open. Bloomberg reported that senior executives at Chinese state-owned gas firms were told Beijing had urged Iranian counterparts not to target oil and LNG tankers. Wang Yi told his Iranian counterpart Beijing supports Iran's right to defend itself, but Tehran should heed its neighbors' concerns. That is as close to a rebuke as Beijing delivers to its partners. And yet, Iran has not changed course. China's leverage, the leverage of being Iran's largest trading partner and economic lifeline, has produced nothing on the ground so far. In my view, this is the most revealing strategic dynamic of the entire conflict. Beijing cares about the oil. It does not care about the regime, and those two positions are in direct tension right now for the first time. Foreign Affairs published a sharp analysis this week. If Beijing's pressure on Tehran fails, and so far it is failing, China faces a strategic dilemma with no clean exit. That framing deserves attention. China holds an estimated 1.2 billion barrels of onshore crude stockpiles as of January, per CNBC. That buffer buys time, but it does not solve a closed corridor that carries half of China's seaborne energy imports. CNBC noted China's shift to EVs and renewables gives it a partial hedge that did not exist in previous Gulf crises. China is less exposed than 5 years ago, but less exposed is not the same as insulated. According to CSIS, the Strait still accounts for 40% to 50% of China's seaborne oil imports. A multi-week closure at that scale is not something any major economy absorbs without real economic damage. The Chinese naval dimension adds another layer. Beijing's 48th Fleet, destroyer Tangshan and frigate Docking, moved toward the Strait for Maritime Security Belt 2026 exercises with Russia and Iran in February. Those vessels did not pull back when Operation Epic Fury began. But per military.com, China's concern is not defending Iran. It is protecting commercial interests and watching American systems operate at close range. That matters strategically. Every system the US and Israel deploy here is being observed and cataloged by Chinese military planners for future reference. This conflict is a live intelligence operation for Beijing. Xi Jinping is expected to meet Trump in the coming weeks. Per military.com, China's priority is trade and Asia positioning, not the Iranian regime. The war has complicated that agenda in ways still being worked out. Now, let's talk about Saudi Arabia, because Riyadh's position in this crisis is the most paradoxical of any country involved and is almost entirely absent from mainstream oil price coverage. On March the 2nd, 2 Iranian drones targeted Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery, the largest in the kingdom. Both were intercepted. Debris caused a small fire. Aramco shut the facility down as a precaution. According to Wikipedia and Al Jazeera, the refinery is expected to remain closed for weeks while export routes are rerouted. Ras Tanura refines more than 500,000 barrels per day. It is not a secondary facility. S&P Global Ratings noted that 89% of Saudi Arabia's energy exports flow through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran struck the refinery and effectively handed Riyadh an impossible strategic and financial choice simultaneously. On one hand, higher oil prices benefit Saudi Arabia directly. Its finance ministry had projected a 3.3% fiscal deficit for 2026 when oil was at $60 per barrel. That math changes significantly above $100 per barrel. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia cannot export at full capacity while the strait is closed and Ras Tanura is shut. The kingdom's east-west pipeline through Yanbu can carry roughly 2 to 4 million barrels per day, per AGBI. That is a fraction of Saudi Arabia's normal 6 million barrels per day through Hormuz. Bloomberg's Javier Blas called the east-west pipeline the infrastructure built for this moment, but it cannot replace the strait. OPEC Plus held an emergency meeting on March 1st and agreed to raise output by 206,000 barrels per day from April. Analysts were immediately skeptical. You cannot ship what you cannot move through a closed waterway. Halima Croft at RBC confirmed it. Spare capacity sits in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but export constraints mean more output provides almost no relief while Hormuz stays impaired. You cannot ship what cannot move. Russia is the quiet beneficiary. Al Jazeera cited an analyst directly. Moscow is benefiting from lost Saudi and Iranian crude and is increasing exports to China and India at higher prices. No Hormuz exposure at all. Every day this continues, Russia's energy revenue grows and its leverage in Asian markets deepens, without spending a ruble or firing a single shot in this conflict. That asymmetry is worth naming clearly. The economic map of this crisis is being redrawn in real time. China is the world's largest energy importer facing a closed corridor. Saudi Arabia is the top exporter unable to fully export. Russia is the unintended winner. Spare capacity, overland routes, and zero Hormuz exposure. Every day the disruption continues, Moscow's leverage in Asian energy markets grows deeper. G7 finance ministers are meeting this week on emergency reserve coordination. Energy Secretary Chris Wright said March 8th that one major tanker had already transited Hormuz, calling it an early sign of opening. Iran ruled out any immediate ceasefire while strikes continue. 3 parties, 3 incompatible positions, no off-ramp currently visible from any direction. That is the configuration that produced $100 oil on March 9th. And at the center of it all is a supreme leader appointed under bombs, backed by the IRGC, personally grieving, and chosen, in the words of one assembly member, specifically because he would be hated by the enemy. Drop a comment right now. Do you think this conflict resolves within 30 days, or does the disruption run deeper? Every perspective in the comments right now is worth reading. If you watch this full video, hit subscribe. This channel covers the systems, the money, and the real decisions, the ones being made in rooms that cameras never enter. Stay with us.